Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Forward Maryland. I'm Bill Woodcock.
And I'm Jason Booms.
Jason, how's your week been?
Been full of excitement and mystery and intrigue. But other than that, pretty normal, actually.
I thought that was a normal week.
That's what I'm saying. How about you,
Excellent.
Bill?
It has been a week of legend, so more to be revealed in time. I wish I could share, but I cannot.
Oh,
Um,
exciting teaser there.
oh, indeed, indeed, it's the biggest week since the debut of the Howard Effin County T-shirts way back when. So we are honored tonight, and I'm wearing my Oakland Mills colors proudly this evening because we have a fine resident from the village of Oakland Mills and a local author who is the author of a terrific book that came out earlier this year, back in April. The book is called Losing John, A Teen's Tragic Death, a Police Cover-Up, a Community's Fight for Justice. And the name of the author is David Parrish, and we're proud to welcome David here tonight. David, welcome to Forward Maryland.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Well, and there's a lot of stuff we want to get into about the book and a lot of the content therein. And I just want to take a little moment of personal privilege. I'm very connected to the story within this book. For those of you who may not know, and I don't want to get too much down the rabbit hole of talking about the book's content, but it's about a death of a young Columbia man named John Bowie in 1990. And in David's book, there's a lot of discussion about the investigation regarding Mr. Bowie's death, and the Howard County grand jury is mentioned. I was a member of the grand jury that heard the Bowie case, and I would say that the portrayal of the grand jury in the book is very accurate. It's very factual. But there are also a couple things, and David and I had talked about this prior to coming on this show tonight. There are a couple of things I wanted to say, not just as one of those 23 citizens, but also as an Oakland Mills resident myself. I was chair of the village board for 4.5 years, and also as a father and as a responsible person in Howard County. David, clear to me that there were two things. Two things I wanted to communicate, and maybe I'm directing this at you, but maybe the direction is towards all of the people who were affected by this passing. I hope that it didn't seem, and I'm sure that it did seem at the time, that the grand jury was very slanted in one direction. I could tell you that unequivocally was not the case. There were more allies on the grand jury in 1990 than certainly what the decision making or what the public decision was read of the grand jury indicated. Secondly, and I guess this also stands to effect number one, is that it's very clear that the grand jury did not hear everything that was within the evidence of the case at the time. And I realize that in 30 years, memories flag, but there were items in your recollection, which again is extraordinarily detailed, where I was like, oh yeah, that jogged a memory bank. But there were also many, many other things that when I read this, I was like, wow, because these are things I've seen and I've understood for the first time. So I did want you to know that. I really commend the way that you have brought this back from 30 years in the past, having had a small role to be involved in these events. They came back for me like they happened yesterday. But I also believe, in sharing that little bit of perspective as well. So I hope that is comforting to people who knew Mr. Bowie his family, his friends, his loved ones, as if we, as of which you were one. I hope that is helpful.
It is helpful, and I appreciate you saying that. I do find that comforting because you're right. At the time, our perception was based on what we read in the newspapers and what little bit of information we had, not being a detailed part of the grand jury. And seeing the results, we were, of course, disappointed. But I believed then, and as I believe now, that if the grand jury had heard the things that we knew and that the police knew, that things could have turned out completely differently. And that was a major motivation for me to write the book, to just lay it out there. There are things that just, to me, were unbelievable. Police knew about them, the family knew about them, made sure the police knew about them. And I thought, these folks in the grand jury simply could not have made a decision based on that information. I just can't believe that would have happened. I have more faith in people than that. So I appreciate you saying that. And I think the family and the friends would find that comforting.
Well, thank you. I hope so too. Let me kick off the questions and then I'll defer to Jason. But along the lines of what I indicated before, I mean, like I said, I mean, these conversations and recollections, I mean, you know, you use a lot of quotes, not a lot of anecdotal, this person said to me, that person said to me. I mean, there's a lot of detail there. How were you able to get that much detail down after 30 years?
A couple of answers to that. One is I was right there. Those are conversations that actually took place. I had access to all the records that the family had access to, that attorneys had access to. I had the court records. I had the police reports. And I kept notes. And also, that's part of the answer. But the other part of the answer is they're just burned in memory. This was one of those things that happens to you that you just don't forget.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's my answer to that.
No, and that's a great answer. Jason, you had.
Yeah, actually, a couple of things, David. Well, first of all, having just finished the book this morning, the thing that struck me, and I'm not a particular fan of the true crime genre. I do watch a lot of related programming. My wife loves the ID channel. But I was taken by, yes, as Bill commented on, the almost Woodward-esque quality of having quotes within the narrative that very captured one specific point in time, combined with the true crime elements, combined with the fact that you were very much a part of the narrative. But I was wondering, can you take us back a little bit? I moved to Columbia in 2011, so I'll be a newcomer if I live here another 50 years. But in Howard County in 1990, just doing some quick checking, we had 187,000 people that lived here according to the census. 2019, we're looking at 325,000. And one of the things I noted was a little bit of a theme talking about, you know, the new Columbians, new America, and sort of talking about some of the older folks that had been here, you know, prior to. Can you talk about what the culture in Howard County was like back in 1990?
As way of background, I grew up in a rural area. I'm very comfortable with people who, I grew up on a farm. I'm comfortable with people who are from that environment. And in a way, it didn't bother me that there was the difference. But you did notice in politics, particularly, that there were kind of two ways of looking at things, that there were the interlopers, there were the people who'd moved in. And even though I had similar background, I was one of those folks. And there were the people who had been here since forever. And they were very sensitive to the fact that when James Rouse started making his dream a reality and creating Columbia, he was a bit secretive about it. He wanted to buy up land and begin to implement it. And it created rumors in the county that maybe there was a communist plot who's buying up all this land. There's a lot of sensitivity to that subject. And it existed throughout the time in the book, and even later, you would have different people on the Columbia Association, the county council, and they would take points of view based on their particular background. And it was obvious, and nice folks. They just had their own way of looking at things. And that, to me, that did play a role in the book. There was a bit of an us versus them mentality. And part of that was not my own experience. It was because I was talking with people who were in positions that interacted with political people more often than I did. And they just made me aware of that.
And one thing that was fascinating too, just reading through the pages, was how much of, I mean, even to this day, Columbia still has a bit of a small town feel, despite the fact population is what, a little over 100,000 at this point, Bill? David?
About 100, yeah, a little bit more, I think.
It still feels, and perhaps it's more, you know, we always joke about the echo chamber, the folks that are the activists in the community, and everyone seems to know each other from that perspective. But the level of intermingling of people within the book, that the degrees of separation, sometimes it was 1 degree, maybe 2 degrees, but people would be privy to conversations. They'd be able to, oh, I actually just overheard that conversation, or running into someone who they had just talked about earlier. It really gave the characters this, you know, sort of small town bubble within a much larger setting. And I'm just curious, you know, did you feel that at the time, or there was not so much something you thought about?
At the time, I wasn't thinking about it. That's just the way it was.
Mm-hmm.
I know that when I moved here, I came from rural North Carolina, and from there I followed a job to Mississippi.
Mm-hmm.
And my wife and I wanted to live closer to both families, and so we picked a place that was between both. And when I found out about Columbia and I came up here and I looked around, I thought, this has got to be the place. I love this place. Mm-hmm. I went into the local, at that time, they had an exhibit center, and they showed a film. You stood there with other people and you watched the film, and it told you how you were going to be living on the streets for people from all religions, all races. They were going to be your neighbors. And I love that. That's the way I wanted my kids to grow up. And that's the way that the young people in the book grew up. Mm-hmm. I don't know what else to say about that, except I read the papers now, and I hear that people are still trying to learn to get together in a way that these young people grew up being together. Mm-hmm. It just, ethnicity didn't matter. Race didn't matter. Religion didn't matter. These were your friends. These were your neighbors.
Yeah, I guess what really came through is that real sense of community, despite the fact it was definitely a growing community. When you wrote about the interactions with people, and sort of the level of support that John's parents had received from so many different people, you know, regular everyday neighborhood folk to electeds to reverends. It really did seem to, in some way, encapsulate that Columbia dream of, you know, all of us working together. So I think in that regard, it seemed to capture what I would envision Columbia would have been like from 30 years ago, outside, of course, of the tragedy.
Well, I think, to a certain extent, people like that everywhere. Mm-hmm. You might have one political stand, another political stand, but your car is broken down on the side of the road. Somebody's going to stop and give you a hand. It turns out to be somebody you know, or somebody you're getting acquainted with. I think basically that's the way people are, as long as we're getting to know the people. Mm-hmm. And in a very dramatic way, Columbia just set out to really be like that. And I think my experience is we still are. Mm-hmm. And I didn't set out to characterize that. That's just the way it was. And so by writing it down, I'm glad that came through.
Mm-hmm. So David, I mean, you know, being you know, from early childhood, a Howard Countyan, I mean, you know, as Jason was alluding to, I mean, the characterization of Columbia in the late 80s, early 90s was, again, spot on and very close to home. And in the book, I mean, there is a veritable who's who of not just Howard County politics at the time, but I think, you know, people who would, if there was such a thing as a political / civic Hall of Fame here, they'd all be in it. Liz Bobo, Jim Roby, Jenny Thomas, Bill Himes, John Wright. Yet, you know, another thing that struck me, and again, you know, being an active person in Columbia politics and Columbia affairs, 15 to 20 years later, what struck me also was how much, you know, the more things change, the more they stay the same. You know, a community meeting, you know, where officials who are there to hopefully help allay a community, you know, just kind of don't seem to find it within themselves to say the next right thing that would help put people's minds at ease. Note I said put people's minds at ease, not necessarily give them what you want. And I guess maybe I've become a little bit more jaded to that in recent years. But I mean, how did you guys feel at that time? I mean, you know, you're right. I mean, I agree that I frankly, I mean, I do look back at 30 years ago versus today, and I think the sense of community was better then than it is now. But it seemed to me also that you guys were just as frustrated 30 years ago as I know I feel sometimes in dealing with the powers that be now. How did you guys deal with that?
To begin with, we were all to a certain extent naive. None of us particularly dealt with the local powers that be. We just expected that they were doing their jobs, and we were happy that they were. And then something like this happens, and you just expect that they're going to handle it. And when they don't, you begin by staying naive, and you just keep feeding more information. But wait, what about this? What about that? And slowly you start to get desperate, like, come on, guys, what is going on here? And eventually it becomes combative. Like, listen, what is happening? This is not cut and dried, but clearly there's reason to take it more seriously than it's being taken. I guess frustration, desperation, anger, sometimes fear, they all played a part.
Mm-hmm. And I would love to believe that should a similar set of circumstances happen today, that County Executive Ball, State's Attorney Gibson, Police Chief Myers would not handle things like were handled then. I totally want to believe that in my heart of hearts. But I can't not go back to, you know, how similar. I mean, what strikes me is Reverend Wright, who is an irascible person as they come. I love John Wright. As the head of the Howard County NAACP, protecting the rights of a young white Howard County man's family. And what struck me also was how similar this is to what's going on, not so much in Howard County, but nationally, with treatment of people of color by police. Is that I mean, do you get the same sense or feeling of that as looking at news today and things that are going on today?
I'm not as naive as I was back then. I think that when people feel awkward, you know, what am I going to do with this information? It's easy to turn your head and deal with other things. When you're immediately confronted with something like this. Just as an example, I have friends who are police officers, and I have an appreciation for how uncomfortable it must be to feel that you're a bit of a loner thinking that something should be different. You have a family to feed, you have a job that you put time and effort into, you're not sure how much support you have. I understand that. I don't understand it like they do, but I can certainly recognize it. On the other hand, I think that the world is turning a corner now. That we've reached a point as a nation, we've reached a point worldwide where it's not long until a lot of things won't be put up with anymore. You can just look around, read the newspaper. It's happening all around us. And we're not quite there yet, but the pressure is there to be there. The culture is going to change. I believe that. But so far as how would the county handle it now, I don't know. I can't imagine they don't know that the book's out. It's all over the nation.
Right.
Nobody's called me. What can I say?
Right.
And I wouldn't care. I don't want to be called if they just quietly take care of things behind the scene and do what I think would have been the right thing to do 30 years ago. I'd love to read in the newspaper one day and nobody ever talk to me and say, there's a headline saying, guess what? We solved this. We know what happened and we're willing to face up and deal with it.
Well, I know Jason had a couple questions that were a little bit more specific to the case, so.
Yeah, thanks. Well, the first thing is actually, I'd like to follow up on what you just mentioned. What do you think the odds are of that actually happening?
If I was somebody who knew something, I would be very reluctant to come forward unless I knew I was safe. That's my first thought. I've been told by particularly my literary agent and people who are savvy to the literary world and true crime world, that there are people who just love to read things and try to get into it and see if they can solve it. And all I can say is, in this case, don't do that. There are just too many indications that this could get really dangerous in a hurry. If anybody's going to solve it, it's going to be a responsible investigating agency. And I will do everything I can to keep from having a media circus about it, because that's not going to accomplish anything. What are the odds that it'll happen? We can only hope, you know.
Well, and that's one thing too. I mean, the sense of danger, I think, really permeated throughout. Just when you thought things were sort of, okay, this is the new life that people have to, we're working on solving this, but there seemed to be so many events that took place which got directly to the heart of particularly Sandra's personal well-being. And I mean, you felt the terror that she, to a certain extent, that she must have felt. But going to the relationship you had with John's parents for a second, the thing which struck me is you seem to be a part of the inner circle very quickly in terms of, you know, at this point in time in their lives, going through, you know, what John was talking about that happened to him, and then his let's call it passing. It seems that you were brought on as a confidant very quickly, even though there were seemingly times when perhaps Sandra was a bit, you know, questioned at times if you were always on the right track. But can you talk about that? Did it feel like things moved very quickly for you to play that sort of role, helping out the family?
I never thought about it at the time. Excuse me one moment.
Oh, sure.
I was not the only one. There were a lot of people in similar positions. And it was just something I didn't think about. At the time that this happened, I didn't know the family that well. I knew them because I'd coached the kids in baseball and I saw the parents at the ball games. And then I was really kind of awkward about going over and offering my condolences. But then I started to hear things, and I guess one way to say it is it came down to, what do I believe about myself? It's like you're walking along the lake and you see somebody drowning. What do? You don't walk away. It just never entered my mind. And there are other friends who could say the same thing. She had a huge group of people who got involved just because they were there. They saw it.
Now, it did seem as though you possibly risked arrest on at least one occasion that I can recall from the book. But in terms of your own, did you feel a personal sense of fear? Some of the events you covered, it seemed as though some of the forces that were arrayed against the family seemed extremely determined. So did you feel any sense of personal trepidation? Were you looking around your shoulder at night? I mean, what was going on emotionally with you during this time?
My literary agent wants me to answer a bit like this to begin with. This is an unsolved case, and that's common in true crime books.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't set out to write a true crime book. I'd never read one knowingly except for In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. I was not familiar with the genre. I didn't know anything about it. Mm-hmm. I think mine and others, my naivete was to my advantage. Anybody who got deeply involved knew that I didn't know what happened. And I think that was my biggest safety net. I think it was the biggest safety net for my family. Mm-hmm. That said, there were times when I was terrified, when I began to realize what kind of thing we might be talking about. Mm-hmm. There's no question. So the answer is not always. It wasn't a daily fear. Mm-hmm. But once in a while, I would stop and do a gut check and think, goodness, where are we?
Mm-hmm. Understand. Bill?
David, I'm going to ask next maybe what should have been the first question we asked. But we, as you can tell, we like to get into it. What motivated you to tell this story after 30 years? Because you certainly didn't have to.
I tried to tell it 30 years ago, 25 years ago. The reason being that I just didn't believe that other people would put up with what we had witnessed if they knew what it was about. And I put out an earlier manuscript. I distributed it locally, and not much came of it. And I basically put it on the shelf in the closet, and that was into that. And then someone came along and said, we've come across this and we would like to publish it. We would like to represent you. And that got it going again. And so we kind of cut it down to, at the time I wrote it down, I didn't know what was significant and what wasn't, and it was much larger. And there were a lot of things that make your eyes glass over now because they just turned out to be red herrings and didn't lead anywhere. But over a course of 2 years, actually, we pared it down and put it in the shape that it is now. It was based entirely on original notes.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, and this might be my last question.
Let me correct myself. One of the personal blessings of getting back into it was getting back in touch with the family, and it was based on notes and on contacting the family and double checking things. And without them, I simply could not have done it.
And like I said, I mean, it's very well put together. It's very well researched, in my opinion. And I guess, and this might be my last question, but is there a message that you wanted to communicate? And I agree with you. I mean, I don't think, we're not unsolved mysteries here, and we're not here to adjudicate that. But this, I mean, when I finished reading the book, I mean, to me, this was a time capsule from another time in the same community, and then looking at what we're dealing with now, still within the microcosm of the Howard County community, and how much changed, how much hasn't at all. Do you feel that there's a lesson to be learned by folks who are reading this book?
I've been really surprised, first, by the fact that it has been distributed nationally, and also by the comments that I've gotten from people all over the country saying that they think it's very relevant to what's going on today in police accountability. I didn't see that coming, but there's just no question that there is a relevance there. For me, I only wanted one thing from the beginning, and that was I wanted to know what really happened. I think that if it had been demonstrated to John's family and friends that John had committed suicide, that happens. You know, it's tragic, but they could have dealt with it if they thought that was an honest thing. But it clearly was not, and they felt that they were not being dealt with honestly. And that's what they have carried with them all these years. If I had one thing I could hope for, it would be that someone actually, as I said earlier, could feel safe in finding a way to come forward and give them that resolution that they would love to have. I read the newspapers and I see that this is the kind of thing that has happened to people all over the country. There are stories like this. I wasn't aware of them. But I can appreciate the value of feeling some sort of resolution. And I would hope there would be more.
I think that the unintended positive consequences are a terrific thing, and it's a credit to you as an author. I mean, I think James Joyce wrote Ulysses to talk about some guy's day. I don't think they intended that to be the most overanalyzed book in the history of literature. Jason?
Actually, I've got two questions. And again, turning to the idea of sort of what's going on today, are there any specific reforms that you would like to see regarding police practices, or really anything about the criminal justice system as a whole that you think had been in place in 1990 might have allowed for more opportunity for the victims' voices to be heard and for justice to be carried out?
Yes, two interesting observations about that come immediately to mind. As I said, I have friends that are police officers. Mm-hmm. There's one I've had breakfast with a few times recently, and mentioned that this simply would not happen in the place where they were an officer. That their area would not put up with it. It would be a reflection on them. It would be reflection on them personally and on their department. Mm-hmm. That other officers would say, no, not this. Mm-hmm. But then I came back with, well, look at what you're reading in the newspaper, and they acknowledged that those things were realities. Mm-hmm. The other is this same person. We were having breakfast, and I mentioned something that one of the investigating agencies said about how they thought John died, and sort of to explain the circumstances in a palatable way that did not have to do with homicide. Mm-hmm. And this police officer said to me, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard. Mm-hmm. So.
Gotcha. One question, are you still friends with that police officer in North Carolina?
Yes, he's a lifelong friend. In fact, on the day that, of course, he's retired now, mm-hmm. but on the day that was the 50th anniversary of the moon landing, he contacted me and said, hey, do you know where you were 50 years ago? I said, of course I do.
Wow, that is awesome. Well, the last question I had, again, this goes to more perhaps of your personal life, but I would love if your next book was about your mother. One of the most fascinating characters, and I obviously going into the sort of novel, you don't expect that the kinds of conversations you had with her would necessarily fit into your traditional true crime work, but it was just fascinating to. Number one, to hear how on point she was about several matters. It seems to me there must be another book about her somewhere, just given her ability to see things. That was just fascinating.
Well, to me, it was the way I grew up, so it was just natural. But you're right, it was an absolute blessing to have that added source of information.
Mm-hmm. And she definitely seemed to help. So, I mean, just from a narrative perspective, it was almost as though she was there, even though there was a distance where she was residing compared to Columbia. But I was definitely glad you included her in the work. It really rounded it out.
Well, I had some reservation because some people have their skepticism, and that's a good thing because skepticism kind of keeps things balanced. But it's just the way it was. That it
Mhm.
was a valuable source of information, and I knew that.
Mhm.
Is there another book in your future, David? And what would it be about? Jason just had a great idea for you.
Um, I'm kind of caught off guard by that question because I didn't write this book to be an author. I wrote this book because it happened.
Right.
But it has been suggested that I write another, and of course that causes your mind to whirl. Like, what could it be? And I agree. Something about my mother would be fascinating. A friend who's a police officer said, "I'll tell you what your next book's about if you're so lucky. You get to talk about what really happened." So
Mhm.
there are possibilities.
Mhm. I think that would be the ideal topic. I mean, because that's the thing. After finishing the book, you definitely wanted the resolution that everyone, I think, is looking for at that point. So if the opportunity presented itself, that'd be a wonderful read.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I hope we get the opportunity to talk about that.
Mhm.
I hope so too, David. I hope so too. You know, we're kind of setting to wrap up. I mean, is there anything else you wanted to mention?
I think we've covered it well.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate your time, and thank you for being a terrific guest. And hope we can have you on again at some point. If not to talk about this subject matter, then something else down the road.
Well, thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Our pleasure. Our pleasure. The book again is Losing John, a teen's tragic death, police cover up, and a community's fight for justice. It's available on Amazon. That's where we found it. So please feel free to check it out. It's in Kindle or on paperback. And Jason, anything you want to end up on?
Yep. No further thoughts from me.
And we are busily assembling guests for next week's shows. So more news on that. Just watch the intro tubes for that. And David Parrish, again, thank you for being a terrific guest. Jason, as always, a pleasure.
All right.
And I'm Bill Woodcock. You have been listening or watching Forward Maryland. Thank you for stopping by, everybody. Have a great day. Take care.